Hey there, welcome back to my channel. Let's have a little chat about LPG as an AC refrigerant. So, why would anyone want to do that? Well, at least for me, living in Europe, reasons are quite easy. The commonly used AC refrigerant in most automotive AC systems is R-134a, and the prices for this refrigerant have exploded at the beginning of this year. We're climbing from about 8 euros in 2015, or even below, I think it was around 5 euros per kilogram, up to 35, and it is expected that end of the year we are around 60 euros per kilogram of refrigerant, which is ridiculous. So why is that? So in Europe, due to European regulation 517-2014, the production amount of R-134a is reduced by 37% compared to the year 2015, because this refrigerant has a pretty high global warming potential. I think it's somewhere around in the 1500. So the European Union wants to ban this step by step. So of course, if the available amount on the market is lower, the price is gonna increase. So the European Union had a plan to replace this refrigerant with the modern alternative R-134YF, but as I quoted here, this failed pretty much. Multiple car manufacturers found out in crash tests that this refrigerant in an accident might burn and might generate some pretty nasty fumes when burning. So most of the manufacturers actually refused to use this refrigerant in their new cars. For older vehicles, the situation is even more complicated, because the European Union mandates the manufacturer of the car to state which refrigerant has to be used. So if you now use the modern replacement, you render your vehicle illegal, because you're not using what the manufacturer stated. So this vehicle becomes illegal in Europe. There's a pretty easy solution to this dilemma, sort of. In Australia, for example, they use propane as a refrigerant for like decades already. Even in Germany, there are some stationary refrigeration systems which use propane. Propane as a refrigerant is commonly referred to R290. I stated here LPG because will not talk specifically about propane, because as you will see, propane does have some disadvantages, why we should use a mix of propane and R600. Please don't confuse this with R600a. R600 is butane, R600a is isobutane. The difference is in the boiling point and low temperatures. So anyway, propane, or basically flammable hydrocarbons in AC systems. The big advantage, of course, is cost. Like a kilogram of LPG is around €1 on a LPG gas station. Propane has a pretty low global warming potential of, I think, around 3, but it's substantially lower than the commonly used fluorinated refrigerants. And of course, it's easier to obtain, because technically, as a consumer, you're not allowed to purchase and use. Actually, you're allowed to purchase, but you're not allowed to use the R-134a refrigerant. Like, you can buy everything on the internet. It's not a problem to get it, but technically, it's not allowed for you to use it as a consumer. Well, the obvious disadvantage of propane or other flammable hydrocarbons are that they are flammable. To me, this isn't a big deal, because think about it that way. Your car AC system contains about a kilogram of refrigerant. With propane you would be talking about like half a kilogram. Just compare this to the 50, 60 plus kilograms of gas or diesel fuel you have in your gas tank. Just think about the small amount we're talking about. You could legally put a small canister of propane for camping in your trunk and nobody cares. So this whole flammability thing, I don't think it's really a big issue, but you have to figure that out for yourself. The next issue, I just put phase diagram in this sheet. We'll get to this because both of these gases have different properties than the commonly used refrigerants. But actually, at least for propane, the difference is not that big. I won't go into the details of butane. I just put it here because we're talking automotive LPG, which is a mix of these both, which gets quite handy. Okay, and the last point, of course, gets us back to what we discussed before. Apart from it's not being legal to use a flammable refrigerant in a system that's not designed for it, of course we're getting back to the point of refilling an AC system with something which is different from what the manufacturer specified. So this brings us in sort of the same issues like the proper replacement, but here we're at least gaining a cheap alternative which is widely available. So in my eyes, this would be the way to go also for new vehicles. I think new AC systems, there are developments for using carbon dioxide as a refrigerant, but there you're dealing with insanely high pressures, so I don't want to say that it's dangerous to use in an AC system. If you design the system properly, it's not a big deal, but really I don't think the effort is worth it. You know, you could just design the system to use propane as a refrigerant. That's something the European Union has to figure out how to legally solve this issue. So I mentioned phase diagram as being an issue. So I wrote down two pressures or two temperatures for both refrigerants, for R-134a and for propane. First is this. We're talking about relative pressures here. I did this just to make it a little bit easier, because if you're filling an AC system or diagnosing an AC system, this is what you're going to read on your gauges. If you look in a phase diagram, you most certainly will see absolute pressure, so just add 1 bar of atmospheric pressure if you want to know the absolute pressures here. So for your standard refrigerant, we're talking about 2.4 bars at 4 degrees Celsius, so this is a quite typical temperature for your evaporator. You might be somewhere between 4 and 8 degrees, but it doesn't really matter. Important is that we're above freezing here. And at 25 bars we're about 80 degrees C, which is a typical pressure for the AC compressor to switch off to prevent overpressuring the system. So for propane, on the other hand, for the same 4 degrees C, we would look at the pressure of 4.3 bars, and for the 80 degrees we would look at the 30 bars. So what does that mean? Let's have a look how AC systems work. So I'm sure if you're watching this video you are familiar with the basic principles of AC systems, but just a short recap. You got a compressor driven by the engine, compressing the refrigerant and pumping it through the condenser in front of the radiator of the car, with a fan blowing air through it. And here the refrigerant condenses and turns into a liquid. So for the R-134a, we're looking at around like 15 to 25 bars depending on the temperature. So in hotter climates you're gonna get higher pressures in this line. So the liquid refrigerant goes through a restriction like expansion valve or capillary tube, or depends on the system, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes. Purpose of this is to lower the pressure of the refrigerant, so the liquid refrigerant at the lower pressure goes into the evaporator where it starts boiling. Looking at these 2.4 bars, we would have a boiling point around 4 degrees, and the compressor gonna pump the now boiled off refrigerant back into the condenser, compressing it. So that's the basic idea. So on older AC systems, or let's say on simpler AC systems, because it's still done on some new cars, this compressor has a fixed displacement, and you have a magnetic clutch between the engine and the compressor, so you can switch it on or off. So basically what these really simple systems do is they're gonna watch for the pressure in this line and switch off the compressor once a certain pressure is reached. Typically are 25 bars, that's why I chose that value, but it depends on the make and model, but it's somewhere in this range, just to prevent overpressurizing the system. And 80 degrees, if you're not able to cool this down below 80 degrees to condense it, obviously something is wrong. And the other thing these old systems many times do is monitoring the temperature of the evaporator to make sure it doesn't drop below 0, because this would mean the evaporator could ice up with water in the air. If we look back to our vapor pressure chart for these systems, keeping the same pressure switch that switches off at 25 bars would mean about 70 degrees C in the condenser compared to 80 degrees C, which makes a difference for the amount of power you can put into the ambient air. This might get you into some problems if you're operating a system in really hot climates, because then the temperature differential to the outside air is just not enough to get the heat out of the refrigerant. But in typical European climates, this shouldn't present a problem at all. As I said, most of these AC systems gonna either monitor the temperature of the evaporator to if the temperature goes below 0, they will switch off the compressor, allow this to heat up a little bit so the ice can melt, and then switch on again. Other older systems just have a timer, just like every 5 minutes or so they switch off the compressor, allow this to warm up a little bit to defrost. So these systems wouldn't have any trouble handling pure propane as a refrigerant. The whole situation gets a little bit more complicated when you're talking about modern vehicles with advanced AC systems, because many cases you don't find a traditional compressor with a magnetic clutch. Instead, here a compressor with variable displacement is used. So you don't have a clutch, you have a compressor that you can regulate everywhere from almost 0 to 100% of its displacement. So what these systems do to regulate themselves is they keep the pressure inside the evaporator constant at around 2.4 bars for R-134a. So this guarantees that you're always around this 4 degrees C in the evaporator, so this won't ice up, and you always get the maximum cooling performance. Of course, these systems also monitor temperature and pressure of the condenser to prevent overpressurizing the system if maybe the expansion valve gets clogged up. And of course, these systems many times also monitor the temperature of the evaporator, and in case there might be icing for whatever reason, they also run a defrost cycle. But these compressors with a variable displacement don't react as fast as a mechanical clutch, so the defrost cycle takes quite a while, and not all AC systems do this. This is really up to how the manufacturer decided to control these systems. So here you would get a little bit of a problem with using propane, because if you look into the vapor pressure chart for propane, 2.4 bars gives us negative 10 degrees C, which will lead to the evaporator icing up. My car is a 2002 Mercedes C-Class with using a variable displacement compressor, and when the evaporator temperature reaches 0 degrees, it turns off the compressor, waits for the evaporator to heat up, and then starts cooling again, which overall reduces the cooling efficiency quite a lot. And I still noticed some icing up with pure propane. Actually, it was quite significant. I was driving down the highway on a little bit more humid day, and after like 20 minutes the AC didn't blow any air anymore because there was just a solid chunk of ice in the evaporator. To mitigate the problem of icing up the evaporator on a pressure controlled AC system is mixing propane and butane. So if you have a look in this chart and you look for the 2.4 bars of pressure in the evaporator and the desired temperature range between 0 and 5 degrees C, we come up with a mix of 30% propane to 70% butane. Again, R600 is butane, R600a is isobutane. Please don't confuse these two, even though you could also use isobutane to achieve the same goal. The ratio would be a little bit different, but best is you figure it out for your application anyway. So with this mix I come up with around 2 degrees C evaporator temperature, which is fine. Could be a little bit higher, but important point being it's above freezing, so I don't have any icing up anymore. So the reason I come up with this mix is I used straight up LPG from the gas station, which in the summer in Germany usually is 40% butane, 40% propane, 60% butane. In the winter it's other way around to keep the pressure in the tank a little bit higher. So I filled my AC system and I ended up with an evaporator temperature of around negative 2 degrees C. So to compensate for this, I just added a bit more butane, and I come up around this 2 degrees C. I can't tell you exactly the amounts because I did a little bit try and error, and if you decide to try the same, I recommend you try it out yourself. Actually, the easier way to go would be first putting the butane in the system because it has a lower vapor pressure, and then slowly add propane until you get down to the desired temperature on your evaporator. One other thing to consider when you want to try filling your AC system with propane or a propane-butane mix is that the density of R-134a is around twice as high as the density of propane or propane-butane mix. So since the amount of refrigerant that should go in a system is stated in kilograms, but really the important thing is the volume of the liquid portion, you should try around half the amount by weight. What I recommend when you go for a propane-butane mix is you go by half the amount by weight. As I said, probably first add 70% of butane and then slowly add the propane until you're happy with your evaporator temperature. or if you don't have a way to evaluate the evaporator temperature, go with 30 or a little bit below 30% propane. Okay, so this brings us back to the final question of this video, using LPG as an AC refrigerant. Keep in mind that this video by no means should be a tutorial. I just wanted to give you some background information about the topic. I think I have shown you everything and shared enough of my experience with this topic so you can make up your own decision and your own opinion about this. If anyone out there has any good ideas or suggestions about this topic, or maybe has tried it out himself and want to share some experience, feel free to leave a comment. I hope you enjoyed watching. See you next time. Bye.